Okay, so topic 1, lesson 7 deals with federalism. And we left off talking about the principles of the Constitution. So today we're going to begin dealing with federalism, which is also a principle or foundational idea behind American government. But we must first understand the different types of systems of government in order to understand federalism and how it applies to the United States. So, real quick, what are the different types of government? Well, first of all, you have a federal system. And in a federal system, the sharing of power is between the national and the regional governments. In our case, the federal and the state governments. There's typically a balance of power and responsibilities between these different levels. Everybody sort of has their roles. And in the United States, all 50 states operate under a federal system. So they have they have their state laws at the local level, but then there are also these federal laws that supersede those state laws, and so there is this sharing of power between the state and the local government. The next type of system is a unitary system, and most nations in the world will employ a unitary system of government. And in this type of government, the power is centralized in the national government. So most all of the power is going to be with the national government. There's not going to be a whole lot of state or regional powers or governments. The national government will sort of dole out any powers that they want to the local government. And this is different from a federal system because if you think about our Constitution, each state is guaranteed certain rights. It's one of our amendments, right? The states, there's powers reserved to the states so that they can operate in a certain manner. In a unitary system, there really are no powers guaranteed to the regional governments unless the national government sort of grants those powers. And so we see this type of government in many different places in the world, but you could certainly see it in England. It's a great example of a unitary system. Then you have a confederal system, and this is the type of government that is characterized by strong, independent regional governments. You have very strong governments at the state level, at the regional level, and as a consequence, you're going to have some very limited powers in a national government. The national government is going to be very weak. And this is the type of government that we in America operated under before our current Constitution, under the Articles of Confederation, and the Confederate States of America in the South during the Civil War operated under a confederal system. Anybody who adheres to a confederal system is going to want to see much more power be located in the regional governments, the state governments, rather than a powerful national government. And so, as I said, if you recall, the United States was under the Articles of Confederation, and the national government under the Articles of Confederation was extremely weak and had to get any sort of power from the states. So we're going to be focusing our attention on the federal system because that's what we utilize in America, and that's going to be something that sort of colors a lot of the problems throughout American history regarding, who has the power, states' rights, or is it a federal right, etc. And I kind of see a federal system sort of as a happy medium between a unitary and a confederal system. Okay, so it's sort of there in the middle. It's a happy medium. Not to say that it's the best form of government, but we have operated under a confederal system and a unitary system, and they both did not fit our needs. And so under a federal system, the regional governments are going to be what are known as laboratories for the works, for what works and for what doesn't. When we go to some of the good things about a federal system is when we want to institute a change, it's very, the United States is very, very large, and if a state sort of initiates that change at their level, it kind of gives us an idea of whether or not it can or cannot be successful. And so we see states as sort of laboratories for democracy. Each state has the ability to make their own laws and to govern within their boundaries, and so if they put something into effect, we can thus sort of play off of the state success and see if it can be operated at a much larger scale with the United States. Now, there's a lot of controversy with the what is known as Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And has been instituted, and we might, some say it has been successful, some say it hasn't, and that's a debate that we're not going to have right now. We just simply don't have the time. But if you look at Massachusetts, they were the first state to sort of do this, and so they were the laboratory state to sort of test this out. And so states under a federal system have the ability to be sort of this laboratory and kind of tells us what works and what doesn't work. Another advantage of a federal system is that it's going to protect citizens from arbitrary power of the government. So you can't just, because the states do have powers guaranteed to them and they can make their own laws, if the federal government tries to, initiate this law, then states can sort of help to, step in and pass laws that sort of, temper the law perhaps. Or if, conversely, if the state tries to make a ridiculous law, then the national government can sort of step in and protect the citizens. So it's a sort of a protection of individuals from arbitrary power. And also under a federal system, states can compete and citizens can move to different regions that better fit their lifestyles. And so if one state sort of better fits your lifestyle than another, then you have the ability to move there. And it sort of gives you this freedom to move about. So we see this all the time, people moving. A lot of the time they move for work purposes or because they get a better paying job in another state. And so people have the ability to move as a result of this federal system, because states can create under a federal system, different sort of personalities, if you will, or they can create different atmospheres or environments that might be more conducive to your lifestyle. And so, you can move to different states. Under a unitary system, it's all going to be dictated by the federal government. And so things are going to be much more similar across the different regional governments. Whereas in states, you travel from one state to another, there's going to be a completely different environment. And so you have the ability to move from state to state, depending on which state sort of best fits your lifestyle. So, what are the motives for federalism in the United States? Well, federalism is meant as a method to correct the Articles of Confederation. And if we recall, the Articles of Confederation did not create a national government that was very strong. The national government could not do things like tax the states to raise money. They couldn't lay taxes. They had to rely on states to voluntarily send money. And, states didn't. And so it created a very, very weak government. The national government could not maintain an army. And so this movement for a new constitution utilizing federalism moves to remedy this, to help maintain a military, to regulate the economy, similarly to promote the economy and to prevent trade wars between the states. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states had all the power. And so when they implement the Constitution with federalism, there's going to be this sharing of power between state and the national governments, and the national governments are going to have the opportunity to start regulating commerce between the different states to make them much more unified, less confederal, more federal. Make them much more unified as a group, and so it helps to regulate commerce. And the government will exercise this regulation of commerce in some very interesting and creative ways to sort of step in when states try to do things. So they do promote the economy. They do try to help prevent trade wars utilizing the federal system. Anti-federalists feared state governments would be swallowed up if we had this federal, very strong national government, this federal system. So they were very against this federal type of government, and obviously if you look at their name, it's right there in the name. But Federalists who supported federalism, said that the system protected liberties and it really moderated the powers of the government, because you do have two different governments, the state and the national governments, to sort of step in on your behalf, and so it's going to help protect your liberties even more. And so we sort of look at this. So how would federalism protect liberty and moderate power? Well, as I've said, it divides the powers or the rights of the government up between the different levels of government. It's a part of the system of checks and balances, right? And we're going to see this when Hamilton writes in the Federalist Paper number 28 and Madison writes in Federalist Paper number 46. People could switch between national and state governments. They could sort of play them off of one another, right? So Madison in Federalist Paper number 10, so over and over they're going to be talking about this idea of utilizing federalism to protect liberty and to moderate power. He's going to say that a small republic can have dominant factions, right? And that a larger republic forces groups to share in the exercise of power. He elaborated that factions, or people pursuing their own political or economic ends, wrought damage to the nation, and that small republics were ill-equipped to deal with these individuals, and the power behind the large republic would be the answer to dealing with these types of groups. So it would be less probable for a variety of groups to infringe upon the rights of the citizens. And if we go back to Federalist Paper number 28 and Federalist Paper number 46, they sort of liken this idea of the national and the state government as parents, right? This idea that if one government was suppressing a person's rights or liberties, they could appeal this decision to the other government to rectify the situation. So if you've ever played your parents against one another, or maybe pitted grandparents against parents to get what you wanted, you can sort of play them against each other to sort of help protect your liberties and protect or moderate the power. If one does something you don't like, you can appeal to the other one to step in on your behalf. And this is a simple example of how one might protect the other. And so, in actuality, we're going to have the Federalists say, even though we do have a strong government in the national realm, you still have the state governments that can moderate that, and they can step in and protect the liberties, and vice versa. So you are actually adding another layer of protection if we utilize federalism, and each level of government is going to have some kind of a power, right? And so in number 10, Federalist Paper number 10, Madison is going to say it's less probable for a wide variety of interests to limit citizens' rights. So if you split the power up between a bunch more people, it's going to be much less probable for a wide variety of these people to limit citizens. So how is power distributed in a federal system? Power is divided between the state and the national governments. Okay? And some powers are exclusive to the national government. So the national government has certain rights and responsibilities that only they can utilize, right? Likewise, some powers are exclusive to the state governments. There are certain powers that only the states sort of utilize and have purview over. And then there are what are called concurrent powers, some that are operated by both. And so we're going to be looking at some of these different powers, okay? And so we're going to turn our attention to the national government. So in a federal system, in the United States federalist system, there are certain rights that are exclusive to the national government. So what are these rights? Well, number one, national defense. Article 1, Section 8 allows the Congress to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. And so it gives them the ability to protect the nation. And later in this section, it also provides that Congress has the ability to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to the use shall be for a term longer than 2 years. So it gives the national government the right to raise an army for national defense and to fund that army for a period of 2 years. It also provides to maintain a navy. And further on, it says to make rules for government and regulation of the land and naval forces. So it gives Congress, or it gives this, not Congress, but it gives the national government in whatever branch the ability to defend the nation. And this is something that only the national government can do. Another thing that only the national government can do is create and regulate a common currency. And so in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution grants the ability of the national government to, quote, coin money and regulate the value thereof. So there's one currency in the United States, and not every different state is using a different currency with different exchange rates. It sort of streamlines that process and gives that power to the national government. Something as banal or mundane as the Postal Service, it gives the national government the sole authority to create and regulate post offices, right? And, again, you guessed it, Article 1, Section 8 says that they have the power to establish post offices. It gives the national government the ability to engage in foreign affairs and make treaties. Article 1, Section 10 forbids states to do this, thereby giving power to the national government to engage in this act. It says, quote, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation. States do not have the power to engage in treaty making or foreign policy on their own. This is something that has to be done at the national level. And then another thing that it does is it gives the national government the power to regulate interstate commerce. Again, in Article 1, Section 8, it says to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So this is one of the ideas that is going to lead to the creation of a new constitution. And so you would expect that this would become a power of the national government, and it does. And as I said before, they're going to use this ability to regulate interstate commerce as a very creative way to regulate some things that maybe they might not have, should have been meddling in. But we're not going to get much into that right now. We might get into that a little bit more later. So, what else? What powers are granted to the national government, right? Well, if we look at Article 1, Section 8, which had such, a lot of those national powers that we looked at just a little while ago, this is the section that has the constitutional enumerated powers, right? This is sort of the go-to area of the Constitution for national government powers. And these are called the enumerated powers and provide for the lawful authority of the national government. And so this is sort of where the national government gets their power, gets their authority from this Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. And the authority not granted to the national government is reserved to the states. Okay? Now, there are 17 enumerated powers. Among them, obviously, things we've talked about: regulate commerce, create that national currency, borrow money, taxing, which they couldn't do before, establishment of the Army and the Navy, and the ability to declare war. Right? Now, here's sort of a kicker. The Constitution also contains what is called the necessary and proper clause. Okay? And this gives the national government some implied powers. If something is enumerated, they're listed. They're spelled out. If something is implied, it's kind of a gray area. It's not something that is listed, but, we can use our powers of maybe reasoning to utilize a different power in any way necessary to perhaps enforce one of the laws that are enumerated, right? And so this implied powers thing, this implied powers clause is going to say that, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So what it's saying is that the national government can use whatever means necessary and proper, whatever means they might need, as long as they do not infringe upon the natural or these rights of individuals, to enforce the powers that they are given. And so this is sort of a very flexible clause, sometimes maybe referred to as the elastic clause, because it can sort of expand the powers of that are granted in the Constitution, depending on the president in office and depending on the situation going on in the nation. So you also have, while the Constitution does give these enumerated or spelled out powers, you also have these implied powers that are utilized by the government but not necessarily given by the Constitution. Now, Article 1, Section 10 prohibits the states from doing certain things. It forbids individual states from making treaties, raising an army, waging war, or printing money. Right? So these things cannot be done by the states. And so let's look a little bit more at these implied powers. The necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8 states that, as I said earlier, the Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Right? And so if you stop right there, that bolded type, right, necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, that's really the crux of the necessary and proper clause. Anything you need to do that is necessary and proper to carry out the powers of the national government, we sort of give you the right to do that. So it's a sort of not necessarily get out of jail free card, but gives the government quite a bit of leeway one way or the other when enforcing their laws. So gives implied powers not listed but necessary to carry out the enumerated powers, gives elasticity to powers needed to adjust to change. So think about elastic, right? If your body adjusts or change, if you get bigger, it can stretch, right? If you get smaller, it can sort of retract. And that's what the necessary and proper clause does. The world changes. And there are things that happen in the United States that the founders could not have planned for. And so they build in this elasticity clause, this necessary and proper clause, to sort of give powers to the national government to sort of adjust to the change that will inevitably come. Right? So, the national government has a lot of power, to do, certain things, but there are also some very specific powers that are exclusive only to state governments. So let's look at those. So state governments have the ability to charter local governments. So within their boundaries, it's their purview to charter local governments at the town level or the municipal level. They have the ability to regulate education. They have the ability to regulate public safety. They have the ability to regulate registering and voting. There's different registration and voting laws depending on the state that you're in. They have the ability to regulate intrastate commerce, which is which is commerce within the state. And then you've got this idea of reserved powers. And let's talk about reserved powers. What are reserved powers? Reserved powers are those which are not listed, but are reserved to the states. Anti-federalists worried about the necessary and proper clause. They were not really excited with this clause that's sort of thrown in there to give the national government a lot of leeway. And so they demand an amendment to protect state powers. And this is given in the 10th Amendment in 1791. And the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Right? And so it says, if it's not delegated to the United States and it's not prohibited by the Constitution in regards to the states, the states reserve these powers respectively, right? And so it sort of gives them a little bit of protection as well, a little bit of leeway as well. And so, although this was seen as a protection, of the national government, we have seen a gradual shift from state to national government. I'm sorry, excuse me. Let me rephrase that. Although this is seen as a protection of the state government, we have seen a gradual shift from it protecting the state governments to really working in favor of the national government. So scratch that first part, and I apologize for that. So there it is, written properly. My apologies. So what are concurrent powers? If you think about the term concurrent, means you can do, something at the same time, right? And so this is an area in which both the state and the national governments have power. And so some of the ways in which the state and national government both have power are the ability to lend and borrow money. National government can lend money and borrow money. The state governments can lend money and borrow money. The ability to levy taxes. We obviously pay a national income tax. If you're in Texas, you're going to end up paying, own property. You're going to pay a property tax to the state of Texas. You also have the sales tax, and so the ability to tax is both at the national and the state levels. And if you're in Texas, you're sort of lucky in some ways because there is no state income tax, and so you don't have to pay a national and a state income tax, but you do have property taxes, which sort of get a little bit ridiculous depending on where you live. Law enforcement, there are national law enforcement agencies, there are state law enforcement agencies, and so they operate those powers concurrently. The ability to charter banks, you have national banks, you have state banks, so they both have the ability to do that. To regulate transportation, you can regulate transportation at a federal level, especially if it deals with interstate commerce. The states can regulate transportation within their boundaries because of intrastate commerce. And so what happens if a state and national government sort of butt heads? Which they inevitably do. If you know anything about American history, state and national governments are constantly butting heads. So what happens if this occurs? Article 6 of the Constitution is the Supremacy Clause, right? And the Supremacy Clause states that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any states to the contrary notwithstanding. So the Supremacy Clause is saying that the Constitution and the laws of the United States at the federal level are supreme. They are the authority of the United States. And if a law is made at the state level that infringes upon a law made at the national level, it is going to be the national law that reigns supreme. And this is going to cause a lot of problems in a lot of different areas of history and government. And so we're going to sort of look at that a little bit later. So this is where this is going to end. We're going to pick up with federalism. It's a very chewy subject, very intense, and so there are 3 lectures dealing with it. You could probably spend an entire semester or year sorting through federalism. Obviously, we're not going to do that. We're going to cover it in 1 week. So stay tuned for the next installment regarding federalism, and we'll talk more about states butting heads with the national government and the powers that are operated depending on the different level of government that you are in.